Previously on Conflict of Nations, my coalition went to war against Afghanistan and his European allies, Ukraine and Turkey. The war destroyed my coalition, with many of my allies being forced to withdraw or worse, sign a one-sided peace deal. Our armies were decimated, and our coalition began to collapse as the losses led to political instability and military coups, as our members left and as our allied governments fell. In this episode of Conflict of Nations, you will witness the Thai military slowly rebuild after the embarrassing defeat at the hands of Afghanistan and its European brothers, by defeating our former ally turned enemy, Myanmar. So if you're with me, I am your host, Redgofighter. This is Conflict of Nations. If you haven't already, leave this video a like and subscribe to the channel, and let's get into it. Getting straight into the video, we're starting off with day 20. The war with Afghanistan had just come to a conclusion, and the war with my former ally, Myanmar, was making slow but solid progress. I had managed to capture most of his southern and coastal cities, effectively making him landlocked. A lot of this early progress was helped greatly by my navy, which could safely fire outside of the enemy's attack range. However, the tough part was just beginning, as Myanmar had most of his military stationed in the deep northern regions of the country. My coalition was now down to 3 members from its 5-member peak. Mexico and Morocco had applied to join us, but they were too distant to join us or provide us with any strategic military or economic advantage, yet alone a boost. Meanwhile, in Europe, Indonesia, my ally, was attempting something crazy. He had sent a cruiser to the Black Sea and began bombarding Ukraine's homeland and coastal cities. I wasn't in support of his actions, as I was his coalition leader and his actions ultimately reflect on me. But he had a lot of headroom because he wasn't going to be invaded anytime soon. By day 21, I was at the government of Myanmar's doorstep. The Mayan people knew it was game over, but the government thought otherwise and fortified the capital. But I ordered my air force to attack the city and tear down its defenses so I could take the city the following day. In my coastal cities, I began mobilizing more ships and sending them to do patrols off my coast, as I was afraid of the European coalition, especially Turkey, from starting a naval assault against me. I had changed my strategy to that of the porcupine strategy, which basically means I was going to make it as painful as possible to invade me and try and use the threat of high military casualties for any invading adversary as a form of deterrence. This is the strategy used by Taiwan today. As part of my strategy, I began investing heavily into air defense systems, such as self-propelled anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles. I also invested into newer generation fighters, helicopter gunships, frigates, and cruisers. I also placed a large number of my ground forces in my homeland cities and began constructing bunkers to increase morale and give my forces an efficiency bonus during urban battles. But building and maintaining such an advanced military network required a lot of resources. My expansion not might, but will stifle my economy, as it will put a lot of pressure on my limited resources, especially my recruitments, fuel, and components. But it would be a necessary sacrifice to fill my promise of protecting the Thai people. Day 22 was just another day in the office. The work was tough, the meetings were endless, but the Thai war machine was still going as fast as it could. developing new technology, manufacturing more weapons and components, mobilizing and training more troops, and extracting as many valuable resources as possible. Though morale was low, the discipline of our people meant that we never gave up until the work was done. Everything and everyone was on full alert. During Day 23, Myanmar launched a surprise offensive towards one of my homeland cities, but their forces were stopped just in the outskirts of Chiang Mai. But that was no problem, as my helicopter gunships stationed in the city could easily decimate those forces there. But what was truly strange was an unknown radar contact in the far north of Myanmar. Myanmar had no functional airfields at the time. Could it be a bomber or a helicopter from Ukraine or Afghanistan, I thought. But the peace deal barred Afghanistan from invading Myanmar, so I sent my fighters to intercept the aircraft, as it could provide some valuable insight into the Europeans' operations in Asia. But unfortunately, the aircraft flew into Afghanistan airspace before I could successfully intercept it. But my National Intelligence Agency believes that it was a simple transport, but it couldn't determine where the transport originated. By day 14, my coalition had completely collapsed. I was the last member, as a political crisis in Vietnam and Indonesia led to the fall of the Vietnamese government, and a harsh political power struggle in Indonesia meant our ally in power was there fighting for political control over his country. To top things off, our offensive in Myanmar was beginning to stall because we couldn't tell how strong the Myanmar forces in the north were. When we were conquering the southern parts of his territory, we used our navy to decimate his forces with little cost to ourselves. But now his forces were out of reach for our ships, and our fighters and helicopters were taking a lot of damage. So providing support was becoming riskier. I didn't want to lose any valuable resources, including my forces and equipment, during this war. The Europeans were still at their full strength, and I was already facing component and mineral shortages. We were alone in this world, but the unity of our people was what was going to define us now. As the hours passed, our options slowly began to wither away. An inaction that was forced upon us, like a chess player with little pieces left. This was it. There was only one way through the storm, and that was through it. Well guys, if you are still watching till this point, please do hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. It means a lot to me and I really appreciate it. December 2024 and January this year were the best months the channel has ever seen. I'm so glad to be joined by a growing number of you. I'm sorry about the disappointing uploads in February, but let's make that right by making March, April, and May the best months the channel has ever seen. So I ask again, please do hit that subscribe button and like this video. Skipping over to day 26, the war with Myanmar was put on pause as our two governments finally signed a ceasefire agreement to give both of us time to reorganize our troops. But it was already clear that it wasn't ending until there was one victor. I used this as an opportunity to begin beefing up my defenses with my border with Vietnam as Ukrainian forces marched down northern China towards his homeland. I was focusing my infantry, armored and air defense units inside my cities in the northeastern parts of my country to stop his aircraft from flying over my homeland, and to stop his troops from capturing my cities and providing space for me to sacrifice land for time so I could plan an appropriate counterattack. In terms of my equipment, I was beginning to invest in F-16 fighters, which was a big win for me, as my air force was now potentially on par with that of Afghanistan. But that didn't matter anymore, because his government would fall in a military coup and his nation would leave the European coalition. And for better news, the political crisis in Indonesia was coming to an end, as his government rejoined the nation with SEP once and for all. Day 27 started off with a strategic ballistic missile strike on Kabul, Afghanistan, by the Indonesian Navy, as his military was launching a new offensive into Afghanistan, taking advantage of the political chaos going on in the country. As for me, things were beginning to get tense as Ukrainian forces captured the capital of Vietnam, Hanoi. Now he was dangerously close to the border, and the war was pretty much inevitable. I had my AWAC patrol the skies near the border 24/7 to at least have eyes on the situation. Things couldn't get more tense as Ukraine began a chemical weapons program. This was very bad because the next thing after a chemical weapons program is a nuclear weapons program. This would give him and his coalition new capabilities to project power at a much more devastating level. I needed to get my own bomb if I was to level the playing field. But I couldn't do this anytime soon because I had fallen greatly in the economic ranking. Day 28, my nerves continued to increase as I sent one of my AWAC aircraft deeper into Vietnam's disputed territories, and it was picking up multiple radar contacts. With my AWAC being intercepted by one of his fighter squadrons, Ukraine was ramping up its efforts in Vietnam. This made me realize that if Ukraine captures a port city in Vietnam, it would leave the Philippines exposed. So I ordered almost all available corvettes I had in my navy to sail to the Philippines and create a blockade on all routes leading to my occupied territories. It was on this day I began heavily investing in my air defenses, with my arms manufacturers in a rush to develop a theater defense system and improve our other already existing systems. I also restationed my fighter squadron on a remote province to avoid them from being damaged in his first strike. Reading through my event logs, I came to a shocking realization that my air defense systems had already engaged Ukraine's bombers, but they and my other units hadn't sustained any damage. What just happened, I thought to myself. The stars were beginning to align, the clock was ticking, and the gears were turning. And the prelude for a new war had just started. But all that aside, after reading through all the logs and going through con news, a full picture was revealed. Ukraine had sent long-range bombers around the South China Sea and launched a series of chemical and conventional missile strikes against my ally, Indonesia. After the strikes, he ordered his bombers to return back to an airbase in central China. But because this time his bombers didn't go around the South China Sea, instead flying in a straight line over my homeland territories, triggering my air defense systems, resulting in the loss of 3 of his bomber squadrons. This was a huge victory for me, but another sign that war was coming. All this brings us to the final day of the episode, day 29. By day 29, Ukraine had begun launching airstrikes into my homeland to attack Indonesian troops providing security at my border. This forced Indonesia to respond by invading Vietnam from my homeland. The cross-border attacks led to significant civilian casualties in my provinces and put shock on the eyes of my people. I declared a state of national emergency and the military was put into heightened alert. My squadrons became airborne, and in a desperate attempt to stop what was coming, I told Ukraine that we were still open to peace and potentially joining his coalition. But the gears were already turning, and we could not stop what was coming. Well guys, that is the end of this episode of Conflict of Nations. If you're still watching, you are a true soldier in this army. It means a lot. If you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss what's coming. I have a whole lineup of exciting videos coming to the channel this March, many of which you do not want to miss. So come on out and join us. See you all in our next episode titled The Clash of Two Suns.